Edward stared out the window of his grand mansion. The city lights twinkled below, a distant and indifferent spectacle. His reflection stared back at him, a mirror to his loneliness. He was a man of immense wealth, his name whispered in hushed tones in the world of finance. Yet his opulent surroundings offered no solace. The silence in the mansion was deafening, a constant reminder of what he lacked. Edward ran a hand through his silver hair, his heart heavy with a familiar ache. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, a pursuit that had consumed his every thought and action. Now, at the twilight of his life, he realized the hollowness of his achievements. There was no one to share his successes, no loving family to ease the burden of his wealth. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt more like a gilded cage. It was a monument to his isolation, a constant reminder of his unfulfilled desires. He yearned for connection, for the simple joy of human companionship. But years of solitude had built an invisible wall around him, separating him from the world outside. His wealth, once a source of pride, now felt like a curse, a barrier to genuine human connection. Edward's wealth, a testament to his business acumen, now felt like an albatross around his neck. It had brought him material comfort, but had failed to fill the void in his life. The people who flocked around him, drawn to his wealth and influence, offered only empty flattery and insincere smiles. He craved authenticity, a connection devoid of ulterior motives. He longed to share his fortune with someone worthy, someone who would appreciate the value of his hard-earned wealth, someone who would use it to make a difference, to spread joy and kindness in a world that seemed increasingly cynical. But who? The question haunted him, a constant reminder of his solitary existence. He thought of donating to charities, of setting up foundations in his name, but these options felt impersonal, lacking the human touch he craved. He yearned for a more profound connection, a legacy that went beyond mere monetary contributions. He wanted to see the impact of his generosity firsthand, to witness the spark of joy in the eyes of the recipient. One evening, as Edward sat by his lonely fireplace, an unconventional thought struck him. What if he could shed his wealth, his identity, and step into the world as an ordinary man? To experience life without the trappings of his fortune, to see people for who they truly were, stripped of any pretense or ulterior motives. The idea was audacious, even reckless, but it ignited a spark of hope within him. He would disguise himself as a beggar, a pauper with nothing but the clothes on his back. He would walk among the common people, observe their lives, and perhaps, just perhaps, find someone worthy of inheriting his vast fortune. He envisioned himself as an unknown observer, a silent benefactor searching for a kindred spirit amidst the bustling city. The idea was daunting, fraught with risks and uncertainties. He was stepping into a world he barely knew, a world where his wealth and status offered no protection, but a strange sense of purpose washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement, a sense of anticipation for the unknown journey ahead. The grand walk-in closet of Edward's mansion felt like a museum of his former life. Suits, meticulously tailored, hung like ghosts of his past. He chose a simple, well-worn shirt and trousers, clothes that spoke of hardship. He stared at his reflection, his face etched with years of calculated risks. He was shedding his skin, embracing the vulnerability of anonymity. He emptied his pockets of credit cards, their power now meaningless. He walked out of his mansion, leaving behind the life he had built. The city night was a stark contrast to the sterile silence of his mansion. The air buzzed with a chaotic symphony of car horns, distant sirens, and the murmur of countless conversations. Edward, now a nameless face in the throng, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He had always moved with purpose, his every step calculated, his presence commanding attention. Now, he was just another shadow, swallowed by the anonymity of the crowd. He found himself on a street lined with shops, their brightly lit windows showcasing goods he had never had to look twice at. The aroma of street food, a mix of spices and grease, filled the air, a far cry from the gourmet meals prepared by his personal chef. He observed people with a newfound fascination, their faces etched with the weariness of their daily struggles, but also with an undercurrent of resilience that he found strangely admirable. The fear, however, was a constant companion. Every dark alleyway seemed to hold unseen dangers, every passerby a potential threat. He clutched his meager belongings close, his senses on high alert. The city, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a concrete jungle, its inhabitants both predator and prey in the game of survival. He had underestimated the raw vulnerability of being invisible, of being just another face lost in the crowd. The realization was sobering, a stark reminder of the privilege he had always taken for granted. He had traded his gilded cage for a different kind of confinement, the fear of the unknown a constant weight on his shoulders. As the night deepened, Edward found himself drawn to a group of homeless people huddled under a bridge. Their makeshift shelters, constructed from cardboard boxes and discarded blankets, spoke of a resilience he was just beginning to understand. He had read about homelessness, seen documentaries, even donated to charities dedicated to the cause, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw reality of their existence. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and a strange sense of kinship. He had never felt so out of place, so acutely aware of the vast gulf that separated his former life from theirs. They eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their gazes hardened by years of hardship and indifference. "Find yourself a spot somewhere else, old man," a gruff voice said, cutting through the silence. "This ain't a charity." Edward swallowed, his carefully prepared words failing him. He had expected hostility, even anger, but there was a weariness in the man's voice that resonated with him. He understood the language of exhaustion, the burden of carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. "I'm new here," Edward finally managed, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Just looking for a place to rest my head for the night." The group eyed him with suspicion, their faces etched with a lifetime of hardship. He was an outsider, an intruder in their fragile world. Edward, acutely aware of their scrutiny, lowered his gaze, his carefully crafted facade crumbling under the weight of their gazes. "New here, huh?" A woman spoke, her voice raspy but surprisingly gentle. "Lost your way, did you?" Edward nodded, unsure how to respond. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, imagined explaining his situation, but the words wouldn't come. How could he, a man who had spent a lifetime amassing wealth, explain his desire to experience their poverty? "Come closer to the fire, old-timer," a young man with kind eyes offered, sensing his unease. "Warm yourself up." Edward hesitated, then moved towards the meager warmth of the fire. The flames, fueled by scraps of wood, cast flickering shadows on their faces, highlighting the lines etched by hardship and the resilience that shone in their eyes. He had never felt so out of place, yet strangely drawn to the raw honesty of their existence. The group shared their meager meal, a pot of something that smelled vaguely of vegetables, and something else Edward couldn't quite place. He accepted a chipped mug and a hunk of bread, his hands stiff and awkward. He, who had dined in the finest restaurants, suddenly felt ashamed of his former life of extravagance. He listened intently as they spoke, their stories a mixture of hardship and resilience. The woman Mary had lost her job and then her home after an illness. The young man, John, had been living on the streets since he was a teenager, abandoned by his family. Each story was a testament to the fragility of life, a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes could change. Edward, used to being the center of attention, found himself an outsider, an observer in their world. He listened more than he spoke, his heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and admiration. These people, stripped of everything society deemed valuable, possessed a strength of spirit he had never encountered in the gilded cages of his former life. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in possessions, but in the strength of human connections, the resilience of the human spirit. These people, despite having nothing, shared what little they had with a generosity that humbled him. Their kindness, offered without expectation or pretense, was a currency far more valuable than anything he had ever possessed. As the night wore on, a strange sense of peace settled over Edward. He was cold, his back ached, and his stomach grumbled with hunger. Yet, he felt strangely content, a feeling that had eluded him for years. He was surrounded by people who welcomed him, offering warmth and shared humanity. For the first time, he wasn't surrounded by sycophants or gold diggers. These people saw him for who he was, a lost soul seeking solace. Their kindness chipped away at his walls, revealing forgotten vulnerability. Sharing a simple meal with strangers, he felt a sense of belonging. He closed his eyes, the fire warming his face, and smiled. The next morning, John, the young man with kind eyes, found a deck of cards in his worn backpack. "Anyone up for a game?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space under the bridge. Edward, who hadn't played cards in years, surprised himself by nodding eagerly. They sat in a circle, the rising sun casting long shadows on the pavement. As they played, their laughter, echoing off the concrete pillars, chased away the chill of the morning air. The game was simple, the stakes even simpler. A few coins John had managed to scrounge up. But the joy on their faces, the camaraderie they shared, was priceless. Edward, used to high-stakes business deals and calculated risks, found himself caught up in the simple pleasure of the game. He watched as Mary, her face lit up with a smile he hadn't seen before, played a winning hand. He saw the quiet pride in John's eyes as he shuffled the cards, his nimble fingers a blur of motion. And he felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of connection he hadn't realized he craved. Later that day, as the city around them stirred to life, John offered Edward a cigarette. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice kind. Edward hesitated. He hadn't smoked in years, the smell reminding him of his former life, of boardrooms filled with cigar smoke and tense negotiations. But something in John's eyes, a silent understanding that transcended words, made him accept. They sat in companionable silence, the smoke curling up towards the sliver of blue sky visible between the concrete pillars. The nicotine hit him with unexpected force, making him cough. John chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Life's a funny thing, isn't it?" John said, his gaze fixed on the city waking up around them. "Throws you curveballs when you least expect it." Edward nodded, surprised by the wisdom in the young man's words. He had always considered himself a master of his own destiny, his life a carefully constructed plan. But this experience, this descent into the heart of his city's underbelly, had stripped him bare, revealing the fallacy of his control. He had come seeking a worthy heir, someone to entrust with his fortune, but in the most unexpected of places, he was finding something far more valuable: the meaning of true wealth, the power of human connection, and the resilience of the human spirit. Days turned into weeks, each one blurring into the next. Edward, shedding his former identity, found comfort in the rhythm of life on the streets. One day, while scavenging in a park, he encountered a young woman sketching with a quiet intensity. Gathering his courage, Edward approached her, drawn to the sorrow in her eyes. He sat beside her on the bench, careful not to startle her. "Edward, you're drawing. It's beautiful. Sarah, I'm Sarah. Edward. Edward." "It's my brother," Sarah said, pointing to the figure in her drawing. Edward remained silent, offering her the space to share her burden. "Sarah, he's sick. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do." Edward felt a profound empathy for this young woman, a stranger who had opened a window into her soul. Edward reached into his bag and pulled out a small box of watercolors. "Edward, here, maybe you can add some color to your drawing." "Sarah, but these are new. You shouldn't." "Edward, it's okay. I want you to have them." "Sarah, thank you. This means more than you know." As Sarah added color to her drawing, Edward watched in silent admiration. He realized that Sarah possessed a gift far more valuable than anything money could buy: the ability to find beauty in suffering. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, but it was in that moment, watching Sarah paint, that he truly understood the power of art. He had embarked on this journey to find an heir, but found something far more profound: the realization that true wealth lay in the human capacity for love and resilience. Weeks melted into months. Edward's days, once ruled by business deals, now flowed with the rhythm of the streets. Yet, a seed of doubt began to grow within him. Was he deluding himself, playing a charade that could never erase his true identity? The weight of his wealth, the life he had left behind, felt like an invisible tether, pulling at the edges of his carefully constructed facade. One evening, while huddled under a bridge, Edward noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was David, his former driver, staring at him with disbelief and disgust. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Edward felt a wave of shame wash over him. David, his face contorted in a grimace, turned away, leaving Edward shaken. That night, sleep eluded Edward. He closed his eyes, but all he saw was David's face, the judgment in his eyes a searing indictment. He had sought to escape the trappings of his wealth, but had he become blind to the struggles of those he had left behind? He missed the comfort of his mansion, the ease with which he had navigated the world. He realized that his journey had been driven by a selfish desire to atone for his own failings. As dawn pierced through the gaps in the bridge, Edward felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He had sought to understand the true meaning of wealth, but the people he had encountered on the streets had taught him that true wealth lay in human connections. He realized that true fulfillment came from living a life aligned with your values. He didn't need to choose one person to inherit his fortune. He could be a catalyst for change. He set off towards the rising sun, ready to paint a new narrative. Edward rose from his makeshift bed, a newfound sense of purpose coursing through him. He didn't need to wear rags to understand the plight of the less fortunate. He could be a force for good from within his own world. He would return to his former life, but he would not be the same man who had walked away. He would honor the stories of those he met by using his wealth to create opportunities. He set off towards the rising sun, the city before him, a canvas for a new narrative. The grand double doors of the mansion loomed before him, daunting, yet welcoming. He had traded the weight of gold for the weight of compassion. The house, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt like a sanctuary. He found his housekeeper, Mrs. Dubois, her eyes filled with relief at his return. He instructed her to summon his lawyer and financial advisor, ready to write a new chapter. The lawyer, surprised at Edward's transformation, listened intently to his wishes. Gone were the complex legal jargon and endless clauses. Edward spoke with clarity, his words infused with lessons from the streets. He spoke of Sarah, a young artist with eyes of pain and hope. Her talent and resilience profoundly impacted him. He established a trust for her brother's care and her art. He spoke of John and Mary, their kindness a beacon in his exile. He created a foundation for housing and support for the homeless. The lawyer, now respectful, documented Edward's wishes. This was a manifesto, a testament to a life transformed. News of Edward's return and his dramatic transformation spread through the city like wildfire. The business world marveled at his decision to walk away, speculating on his sudden change of heart. Some whispered of a breakdown, others of a spiritual awakening. Only Edward knew the true nature of his metamorphosis, the lessons learned in the city's underbelly. He shunned the spotlight, his actions speaking louder than words. He poured his energy into philanthropy, his wealth a tool for positive change. The mansion, once isolated, now hosted fundraisers and strategy meetings. He surrounded himself with passionate people, igniting his vision. He never forgot the importance of human connection and compassion. The greatest inheritance he left was a legacy of kindness and valuing every voice.